I think the first place to start is, why did you all choose to get involved in forming the trust, as it were, and what sort of brought you into the process? Starting with you, Roger.
Well, that was towards the end of what I describe as the protest season, and it was clear that something needed to be done to make sure that the fans were not just represented but had some power. And I think Lou and others had been looking at supporters trusts, finding out what they could do, and it just seemed like the obvious thing to do given the circumstances, particularly. We may have got round to forming one later in more if circumstances had been different, but it was the right time, and it was something I wanted to get involved in.
Definitely, and then I gather a lot of you were involved with WISA.
Yeah.
So do you want to just discuss how that sort of merged into what is now the Dons Trust?
I don't think it's fair to say it merged into Dons Trust. I think when we look back at the campaign years, WISA had a place to actually bring the supporters together. Mags eventually became secretary and took over that role. And she'll tell you, we drove the numbers to higher and higher and higher. But we recognised on the committee that if we were to appeal to the people with money, as in the Vice President's Lounge and the Vice President's Club, they couldn't be associating with a bunch of people who look like anarchists. So we had to have a respectable image, hence the trust movement, so probably sort of fitted that bill. And we end up with a caseworker.
Certainly. And then for you guys, how did you sort of become involved?
I've always been a Wimbledon fan, or my family were, so we obviously were involved in the protests, and I just wanted to help and be involved, and I offered my services. I became secretary, one of the first secretaries, and yeah.
Certainly. And then Dave, I understand, you're a Wimbledon fan yourself?
Well, I became one because of the process of forming the Dons Trust, because I'd only moved to London myself about a year before the process to start the Dons Trust began in earnest.
Yeah.
And like many people new to the city, you end up living where you can find somewhere to live rather than where you choose to live.
Yeah.
And that's usually miles away from anybody you actually know. And because of that first year at Supporters Direct, we were often on the road going to, Chesterfield, Darlington, all these clubs which were starting to have significant problems. I never really had sort of got embedded in the city. So when the Dons Trust was being started and there were working groups taking place, there were meetings nearly every Thursday evening at the Wimbledon Community Centre, and we were sort of shepherding these groups because I was working at Supporters Direct at the time, and it just, after the meetings you'd go to the pub, and slowly it turned out that basically the people I got to know the best in London in a year were all Wimbledon fans through the formation of the Dons Trust. So it kind of all snowballed from there, and somebody says, do you fancy coming to a game at Selhurst Park? I've not got anything else I'm doing that Saturday. You go to a game, and it just sort of slowly builds from there. But my sort of involvement really began because of being appointed the caseworker, as Laurence says, to help the formation of the trust and just kind of give people a bit of a nudge and a steer, and just to keep people moving in the right direction. But it was not the hardest job I've ever done, because what really jumped out was the professionalism and the skill base and the capacity, and just the constant surprising kind of, whatever skill was needed, whatever job was needed to be done, somebody knew somebody. And that could be anything from, do you have an ambulance to spare on which to sell merchandise, through to, as Mags was telling us earlier, somebody who could fix photocopiers. And it was just whatever was needed, there was a resourcefulness to the fan base which was just astonishing.
Certainly, and even 20 years on, it's still the case, very much the case now, I would say.
Absolutely.
Mags, how did you become involved?
Well, I was WISA membership secretary, and we discussed at a WISA meeting, which was some time before the trust launch. There was discussion about supporters trusts, and I think Chris at the meeting that I remember had mentioned that Tottenham had set one up, and there was an awful lot on their website that we went through. So, and then there was the inaugural supporters direct
That's right.
conference.
That's right,
Yeah,
yeah.
and 4 of us went to that, and I think Chris came along in the evening after he finished work, and everything went back. So Whistler decided to get it rolling by organising a meeting and getting people to come along and to talk about forming a trust, and as has been said, that it had to be a board which could converse with the board of the football club, the Wimbledon Football Club at the time, because the aim was different to what Whistler's aims would be. So
I think there was a recognition, I certainly remember from that first meeting, that eventually there will be a decision on Milton Keynes, and everybody hoped it would go in favour of the Whistler position.
Yes.
But there was an understanding that even if you won that battle, that the current owners were going to clear off at that point. There was going to be
and the trust we needed something to be able to in place.
It's like we need to be part of the solution because there will be change, and nobody was voicing. And if we lose, we need a plan B. But it was really obvious to me that it was. Everybody was thinking it, but nobody was speaking of it.
Yeah.
You'd hear it occasionally. Well, we'll set our own club up.
It would bubble up.
Something would come up and say, we'll set our own club up.
Yeah.
And we did.
I can clarify a bit on that point.
Yeah.
Sam and Mam took myself and 3 other members of the Whistler committee for a meal one evening at the Dog and Fox, and this was during the Dublin fiasco. And Sam said to us, well, what will you do if I take the football club to Dublin? And without a second prompt said, Mark piped up, and we'll start again in Dundonald as Wimbledon Town.
Yeah, he's told me this exactly the same story as well.
And the interesting thing is, when we tried to register ASV in Wimbledon, initially as Wimbledon Town, the London FA rejected it.
Oh, they wouldn't have it, would they?
They wouldn't have Wimbledon Town as a registered name for a football club. So that is how AFC Wimbledon came about.
And they wouldn't let us have FC Wimbledon either, if I remember rightly. So someone said, let's stick an A in front of it. And that's how it became. Because AFC doesn't mean anything. No. It's just 3 letters.
Yeah.
And a lot say a fans club, etc. But it doesn't. It's just 3 letters. So
I think it leads nicely into my next question. What were all of your collective sort of visions for the future? Did you sort of know where you wanted it to go once the trust had been founded?
Well, if you look back to the original aims, I'll take Whistler because the aims of Whistler were mirrored eventually in the Dons Trust.
Yeah.
To have a ground in or near Merton.
But I think, as Dave indicated, the aims when the trust was really first set up, we couldn't particularly articulate because we didn't know which way the MK decision was going to go. And so, yes, there was one aim, maybe setting up a football club. The other was maybe what would happen if the owners did disappear and say, right, it's yours, get on with it. Yeah. So I think
we had momentum, didn't we? We had such a big group together during that year. The momentum was there. We already knew somebody who could produce a programme because we've been producing Yellow and Blue. Yeah. And you've got people in various roles. I mean, this document came out asking people to volunteer with the trust when, the trust was being formed. And then we suddenly found we had a vehicle that could own a football club.
I mean, I certainly remember there was some interesting discussions within Supporters Direct, because when it was formed in 2000, it was very much coming out of kind of a New Labour kind of vision of, hey, can't you all just get along?
Yeah.
Have the fans on one side and rich owners here and just play nice together and rather not this unseemly sack the board nonsense, which is heard up and down the grounds. And so it was very much a kind of like, let's all have a partnership together. And a few of us who were working at the coalface were, shall we say, a bit younger, a bit more radical, and were much more enamoured with the kind of German or at the time it was all about Barcelona because it was all we knew about. Over time that got replaced by a richer understanding of, say, the Bundesliga. But we were like, well, why should we own just a part of the club? Why can't we own all of it? So I remember thinking, I hope whatever happens at the end of it, this looked like a group of people who could really make it happen. We'd had Chesterfield, which had kind of fallen into total fan ownership as a was it literally, you know, hot potato, it's going bust, here's the keys, and then running away to and leaving the people to clear up the mess. And there was, and it expanded our horizons as to what was possible. You know, it starts off with Northampton, where they own 10% of the shares, and it was like, well, let's go further. How far can we go, and how high can we take this? And so I remember certainly from my own part that I was hopeful that this was going to be big, but nobody knew how big it would actually get in the end.
Someone who's very inspirational in the process, who's sadly no longer with us, Brian Lomax. Please could you just tell me how important he was?
So it was always difficult for me to sort of get an understanding of just what Brian brought to the party, because I saw it from the inside, and we were a double act, and Brian would go to meetings, and we often used to joke about how it was almost Wesleyan in that sense of just riding around Britain and sort of preaching to create this new time religion. Brian would just tell the story of what had happened at Northampton, about how he, a fan just like everybody else in the room, had decided enough was enough. And they decided that they were going to do something which had not been done before, and this was a compelling message to people. You know, we'd had the best part of, if you read histories of most clubs, this story of fans always being basically taken somewhat for granted, being on the outside of decision making. It was almost your birthright as a fan, and here were people who went, no, this will not pass. And so Brian's story of how they'd made that happen at Northampton Town was really inspirational, and it was much more important than what we had to talk about. So Brian would tell this story, and it was from the heart, and Brian was a passionate orator, he was a brilliant public speaker, could hold the room in the palm of his hand, and he just was totally credible. He wasn't somebody like me who was, why are you here? Well, I'm being paid. Brian was there because he was like you and wanted you to go on the same journey he had gone on. And that was incredibly powerful. And he was also a very charismatic individual and idiosyncratic. And so he was very engaging, very personable, and could deal with people from all walks of life. And because a football club is a place where you find people from all walks of life, he was just, you know, it was the perfect guy in the perfect role at the perfect time.
Certainly. And then you guys, did you all have dealings with Brian? I'm assuming you did.
Not personally, no, just really through the meetings. And I've got to say, I think, Dave, you're underselling yourself, because you were a very good double act. And Brian could do that evangelical stuff, and then you'd come in with some of the practicalities. And it was also clear that you were driven, but maybe in a slightly different way. And you had Brian as the elder statesman, you as the sort of younger, dynamic guy who was going to get... No, so I think when you've got two people, it's important that they complement one another.
Double act.
Certainly, and then...
But you became so passionate.
It was. Well, I always used to get slightly... We used to joke about it on the train home from meetings, that Brian would have the sort of passionate kind of rallying call, and then I'd come along with some really quite boring technical details about the nature of industrial and provident societies. And it was important stuff for the meeting, but it was kind of, I would get more polite applause as opposed to Brian's kind of rapturous standing ovation kind of responses.
Definitely. And then we sort of look back, obviously the main event, we've got the invitation there, if someone wants to hold that up, just so we can have a look. Obviously the launch that happened at the theatre, almost 20 years ago to the day now. What are your sort of main memories from that evening? Did you kind of expect as many people to turn up as they did? And who wants to start first?
Did we ever
I actually arranged it.
I remember meeting the guy with it.
Wimbledon Theatre, because just to get upon myself to do that, but the amount of people that turned up was...
There were quite a lot, weren't there?
It was
fabulous.
And
it was
I mean, for being with WISA, because by then you had two boards. You got the WISA board and you got the Don's Trust board. So WISA are more of a, helping out. We're volunteers for the Trust. Our role then becomes, rather than being involved in running the Trust. So it was different. But I can remember the guy turning up with the FA Cup, because we had to find him, park around the back of the theatre and show him where to go with it and everything. And keeping a
And
good
you
grips on
you
it,
can't touch it.
and you can't touch it,
Yeah.
things like that.
Can't touch it. The
yeah.
two miners with their white gloves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that was my job, was really to get him in and out of the building. But that's about all I. Other than that, I was watching same as everybody else.
I organised the stewarding
Okay.
on the day, and which all went very well, because there wasn't really much for the people to for us
Yeah.
to do, because everyone was very well behaved. You got that real feeling of excitement that something positive was happening after what was a very negative season.
Yeah.
So here we were actually building something, and so there was a great atmosphere. A whole lot of memberships were taken on the day.
And
So
of course,
it
you've got to
was a
mention
really good
Lou at
event.
this point, because
Yeah, of
Lou
course.
had to leave the WISA committee because she took on the role on the trust board. So it's that was the. I think was Lou the only one who moved across?
No, there were others that were on the periphery that weren't on the committee.
Weren't on the committee at the time. Yeah.
That then formed the first Don's Trust board.
Board,
so,
yeah.
But from the point of view of having a board, elected board, because it's actually an official title, with forms actually being filled in and so on and so forth, rather than the committee on the WISA side was very much, you became a WISA committee member. It was an election, obviously, but it wasn't the same sort of standing. But you were actually on an elected board because it was actually covered by the Friendly Society and became a legal position. So it was good.
Didn't Chris move across from?
Chris eventually did. Yeah,
Yes.
eventually. Yeah.
I just remember being blown away by the attendance. You always get nerves from people, and people like Jacki who are organising it. You have this kind of what if nobody comes. You could normally tell if people were there half an hour beforehand, then you knew that there was excitement and anticipation,
Definitely.
and that was definitely the case. And for my own part, I remember being horrifically hungover because a friend who was living in Europe at the time had arrived at the house we were living at, and we'd just gone to the pub and stayed a bit longer than we should, and I'd woken up quite late, and I was really pleased of it in the end because it took away the nerves, because it was quite a thing to be on the stage and just see not a seat to be spare in the entire theatre, and I think it was about 1,500. It was the capacity or some such number.
It was quite a number. Yeah,
It was a big number, as my daughter would say, and it was very nerve-wracking to be speaking, because there were also some, in addition to myself and Brian from Supporters Direct, it was a real opportunity to celebrate that Wimbledon was bigger than the current owners who happened to be in control of it, and so there was a very strong effort to emphasise the continuity of the Wimbledon story, which had gone back, and so there was lots of people who were desperate to hear from and meet, and people who would become much more familiar with as AFC Wimbledon got created, and people like Dickie Guy would be there almost every week. But at that time there weren't those opportunities to sort of meet with these people in quite so frequent a manner, and there was a real sort of buzz around the place. And just to endorse what Roger says, there was a palpable sense that this is happening because we willed it, as opposed to because we are responding to something else the buggers who own our football club have forced us to do. This was a positive step forward, which was a real planting a flagpole to say, and it was a kind of, look what we can do when organising a meeting. Just imagine what we could do if we actually had the keys to the club.
Most definitely,
and that was the document for the Don's Trust launch, the little fold-out thing that everyone got at the launch night. So,
but remember, we pulled a lot of Ivor's experience in design and print with Mark Jones.
And Ivor's auction that night.
Yes.
Something else.
That was something else. Yeah. He certainly knows how to sell something.
I seem to remember Mark Lewis coughing up an awful lot of money.
He did spend a lot of money.
I'm not going to say how much, but it's down to Mark to declare that. But all I would say, it made people sit up and take notice in a way that hadn't been considered before. It made us look very, very serious in our intent.
Professional.
Very, very professional indeed. And it gave us a real fighting start to say we are going to achieve things, come with us.
Absolutely. And quite clearly it works, because we're in this spanking new stadium. It's incredible.
I think the thing that sort of runs the thread that runs through everything is don't tell us that we can't do anything.
Yeah.
Because we'll prove you wrong.
Well, some of us are Capricorns and we're very stubborn.
Some of us are indeed, yeah.
Question I really wanted to ask, what are your opinions on WISA and the trusts now? So who would like to start on this one? I know it's a very broad subject. You all have different views, I would probably imagine. Shall we go around
I'd like
this
to
way?
hear Mag's view, because I mean, she was more involved with WISA than maybe.
I think in what context? Because WISA exists, but at the moment, but it isn't really active. And there's the argument as a fan. I mean, as a fans-owned club, would we be wanting WISA as a protest, or in how would we become involved? I think we're there to. We're not frightened to come forward with our voices. I think any WISA committee member will not stand back if they feel that something isn't right or could be done better, but not in a negative way. I think feedback would be positive from anybody. I'm quite proud to have been on WISA. I'm proud to have been involved with all of this, because there's some amazing people that did an awful lot more than I did. I mean, printing membership forms out is not, a lot of the other stuff that I was part of was the group doing things and being steered. So I think that shouldn't be forgotten. Their part shouldn't be forgotten in all of this, because
it's part of the journey.
Well, if this, we weren't planning to set up something that could own a football club, but the WISA was, the committee could see that there could be a positive side to something else, to bring more people together, supporters together in a different way. So the trust being formed was a great thing, and to be on different committees, and also when we did start AFC Wimbledon, Chris has been made redundant and I'd been made redundant, so an email went round from WISA, can anybody help out? So that's how I got involved with volunteering and in the office and things like that moving forward. But I don't want us to lose trust ownership.
Yeah.
So in terms of that, I'm really proud that we helped that get started, and
yeah.
A lot of people did an awful lot of good things, and
still
do.
WISA was hugely important. Well, during the protest season and before the protest season, in its efforts to try and. Get the club on the straight and narrow, or whatever you want to call it. And was hugely instrumental in the setting up of the trust. Then, subsequent to that, I was heavily involved in getting the colours and the honours back into the borough of Merton, which again was something that was important to a lot of people.
WISA took,
that was
exactly.
very much what WISA could do.
Yeah.
I think it's also important that there is a voice, even though there's a fans-owned club, that fans who don't feel they have a voice still can find a voice through WISA or through some other way, and so it's still important. But that role is still important. I'm not sure what WISA does now, so I can't. That's why I didn't want to answer the question immediately. I think, and I wanted to reflect partly on.
I mean, WISA rescued the gates. There are things like that WISA has done.
There's an awful lot that WISA has done.
And the monument at the corner of Plough Lane was WISA inspired and involved in that. So.
Yeah, but you're not sure what they do now at the moment, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think there's been an active membership campaign from WISA for a long, long time.
I think there's always a place. We used to have this argument, or people would sort of say, do you need a fans organisation in a fans owned club? And I always took the view then, and I take the view now, that you have businesses which might be employee owned, John Lewis's, but that doesn't mean that you can't benefit from a trade union in that workplace. Just because everybody has an equal say in the organisation, it's quite difficult for those people to form a coherent view as to what are the ways forward or what might be done better. And that's where independent supporters groups have always had a massive advantage, in that they tend to be a place where people with talent and ability and know-how gravitate. And if you've either got the internet, well, it's good for some things, but I don't think anybody. I don't think the strongest adherents would say it's a place for cogent criticisms and critiques to be formed, to be presented, and action plans to be developed. And WISA, like many an independent supporters association across the country, was a really important crucible through which the right people in the fan base. You've got a fan base of 8,000 people who are going to Selhurst Park. Without WISA, there would have been just atomised voices, whereas it was able to sort of bring those people together, like mercury, sort of attracting Quicksilver, attracting them together.
The common thing,
and I think if there was I won't say tragedy as such, but there was one of the downsides of WISA having such a strong role was, I think, the initial phase of the Dons Trust's formation and then ownership of the club. There was some people involved in WISA who, because WISA was organising protests against Milton Keynes, and then suddenly that had ended because the battle had been pretty much lost, weren't in a position to move forward with. Now, Chris did step down from WISA and became
I
involved.
had to, because I was working for AFC Wimbledon, so I didn't. Came to a point where I had to decide to step down from WISA.
Yeah.
Because it was conflicting with things I was doing for a trust-owned club, and there was one point where I was very uncomfortable in the office, because something that we had agreed on a WISA committee didn't sit well with somebody who working in the club, and I'm in the office and I'm taking the backlash for it. But it wasn't very comfortable for me. And just at some point I thought, well, I have to decide. If I'm WISA, I can't carry on working at the club.
You had to pick
in
a
that
side,
position, sort of thing. So I had to. I think that I had to make a decision on that time.
Many of the main players had to make that decision as well, because I moved from WISA to the football club, handling the media. Along with Charlie Talbot and a few others as well. And it was a troubling time for it, because where do our knowledge lie? We've actually got a football club now, but are we still a protest movement? But what are we protesting about? Is there a role for a protest, as you say, Dave, in a football club that's been born out of protest? Probably not.
I just want to touch on Roger's point about, WISA perhaps not having as big a role now. Do you feel like that's because the Dons Trust is obviously fully established now, prevalent within the club? Do you feel like that's why? And that's why WISA's not faded into the background? Don't want to be, that's just rude saying that, but less of a role.
No, I think there's a voice for supporters to say if they think something is, the club is getting it wrong and the trust is getting it wrong. I think that voice is probably through meetings as individuals. I don't know if there's a need for an organised protest body in the same way. If there is, then I hope that WISA will sort of reconvene, if you like, and become active again.
Or maybe an independent of the trust, neutral, where if you do have an issue, because if you take it to the trust and something isn't resolved or resolved by the club, maybe there is a position for some independent body.
Like a supporters club?
Like a supporters club, probably, yeah. But
which was the origin
but
of
it's,
how it arrived.
that can converse with both to resolve an issue. Maybe it's something along that lines.
If we cast our mind back to a year before, you're probably not aware of this, Chris, we had 8 fanzines. For a small supporter base, we had 8 fanzines at Plough Lane. And it was 4 of the editors that actually formed Worcester. And because we had the leadership to drive that forward.
Yes.
All four are still involved with the football club in some capacity or not. Some are high, some are low, some are in between, doesn't matter. But what Worcester did and what Don's Trust will continue to do is create friendships. And there's a little word team in there.
Yeah.
Together, everyone achieves more.
Perfect. Couldn't have summed it up better myself. I'm glad you did. Sort of brings me on to the final question. Do you see there being a future for fan ownership, and where do you think it will sit in 10 to 20 years' time? Not just thinking with regards to AFC Wimbledon individually, but football as a whole. Maybe Dave, right person to start with, I guess.
It depends where I am in my kind of, I was going to say sort of monthly biorhythm about, am I optimistic or pessimistic today? The track record of fan-owned clubs is, we have to say, mixed in British football.
Yeah.
And that's partly because, and if not partly, I think the main reason is not because fans don't have the ability to run clubs, it's that the game is inherently inflationary. And if you're trying to bring an approach to managing and owning a football club which is based on making sensible decisions, husbanding your resources as you find them, growing them organically and slowly through bootstrapping, that's a really great strategy for any business, apart from one in the madhouse, which is British football, where the solution is always find somebody who's got some money and get them to give you lots of it to spend on better players, new players, more players, replacement players, backup players. There's a constant hunger for cash to turn into players to play on that field behind us. And in that context, if you're running a club sensibly, that's not a great position to necessarily be in. If everybody else, if the price of being sensible is relegation, then it's part of the warp and weft of football that you can go up a division and go down a division. And most fans, and especially at this club, I think are sanguine about that. But if it's a permanent decline, it's like, oh, we used to be in this league and then that league and then that league. There'll be a point where you go, I'm not so sure about this. And there was a halo effect that after fans took over a club which was in dire straits, there'd be a couple of years where they'd go, like, we've saved it. And then a third year where they'd be like, so what now? And then the fourth year, oh, relegation. And then the fifth year, oh, we're not arrested the decline. It appears that we can go through like prune juice. So there was an inherent problem with it. There's a systemic challenge in British football to sort of make the game safe for ownership models which don't rely on oligarchic or pumped in cash. And AFC Wimbledon is an amazing story of how we've managed to sort of almost walk the tightrope and maintain a I'm going to use the words advisedly, competitive team.
Yes.
In a league where we've consistently, since we entered the Football League and really since we got to the conference, we've always been in the bottom half of the salary levels. Correct. And we've always punched above our weight, and long may that continue. But I wish the game was made safer for us, that there wasn't a kind of point at which we go, well, we've survived in League One, but actually I remember, maybe we can do more, and that was what we did in the 70s. We gambled a bit, and I'm always a bit alive to that, and I hope there would be changes maybe with the Super League, that there's the process working its way now with the government's report. That maybe, just maybe, we might get some action which has the effect of dampening down the madhouse economics, and therefore make the game safer for clubs like us.
You make an interesting point there about government intervention and involvement, because I was involved with the football task force with Mr. Mellor and his football shirt, and quite simply they talked about the same then, and it never happened, and that's why we got into the mess of people coming along and grabbing clubs, relocating in our case, asset stripping and destroying the fabric, because a football club is a community, and we take it out of the community, it's no longer a football club, and that's the danger. We are a catalyst from that point of view to actually determine the future role of our football club in our community, and long may it continue.
And I think one of the things we've done here is the ownership of the club is part of what it is to be a fan of this club. it's what makes this club special. It's part of the story. It's not just something which happened 20 years ago. It's something which happens today. It happens every time there's a game played here. Every time somebody walks into the stadium for the first time, you can bet your bottom dollar that a big part of the reason they walk into the stadium for the first time and are captivated by the story is that they can write themselves into that story by becoming a member of the trust and taking their part alongside everybody else as shouldering the responsibility of owning the club, making decisions about the club. And that's something which I think is it started as kind of not an accident, but we became owners of the football club, and we've come to grow in and inhabit that position in a way which really fits us. And I think it has become part of this. It's like DNA, kind of double helix wrapped around the club now. At least that's what my fervent hope is.
I got chatting to somebody after the game last night. Got the same bus as me, and he was saying that he came to London about 7 years ago. And he'd, come to the game. And he said, and I've just fallen in love with this club. And he said, and I've become a trust member. He said, and I love what it's all about, and that's really sums
what
up
the whole thing's about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is fantastic.
And you're part of the family.
Yeah.
That there's no, you come along, you're part of the family. So
Definitely.
We've grown maturer together. 20 years maturer. We had ideals when we first started out 20 years ago, and now others are taking that candle forward and taking those ideals to a different level, and hopefully will inspire other people up and down the country to do the same.
And I think that point you made, Laurence, earlier about it kind of, there's a friendship issue. It is really heartening that so many of the people, it's not like the same people who were doing everything 20 years ago are still the same people doing everything today. That's the problem.
New people
that
doing
it's that there's a kind of evolution and there's a kind of augmentation of those people with new people coming in. But there are still some people who've been around and are still involved, and they're not jaded and are kind of sitting there going like, oh, you with your fancy new ideas. You were at the meeting in 2004 where we discussed this and it was killed. It's like there's an openness to people coming and getting involved, but there's a continuity. It is like a family.
Yes.
There are people who gravitate and now they move sitting at the more dignified end of the table as opposed to the noisier end, but it's all working in the right direction.
And our children are involved now, which is wonderful. It's passed down the generations.
This is the opportunity where I get the chance to actually embarrass George Jones.
Yes.
Because he's involved. He's actually very much second generation, and he's now very heavily involved on the media side of the football club, helping out the ladies. Very successfully launched this 9 years TV on a match day. We would never have had this 20 years ago.
It's very true, very true. And me, myself, obviously taking on the role of programme editor, it's an honour, especially to follow in names such as Yellow and Blue that we've got here. Lovely to see them displayed. Roger, I wanted to get something from you before we finish. Everyone obviously gets a say on this. Your views on what fan ownership could look like in the future?
It's very difficult because Dave's right in that there is so much money around that it's very difficult for clubs to do what we managed to do, and we were very much born out of crisis. We didn't deliberately drop down to non-league, and if we had been landed with the club as a League Two, as League, I don't know what, probably League One as they were then, Championship as is now, what sort of fist would we made of that? We made a tremendous fist out of finding ourselves in the CCL, getting 6 promotions or so. Another point that Dave made, I'm not sure how sanguine a lot of our supporters are about relegation, because AFC Wimbledon has never been relegated. And a big test of our support base will come when that happens, and it's bound to at some point. I hope it doesn't, but I think it will. And see then, because there is always pressure, there's always people who are going to say, spend money. We got 300,000 from Wally Palmer, why haven't we spent it all?
And part of the issue is that we have to remember that for the vast majority of people who support a club, it's what they do for fun. It's a leisure activity to take them out of what they do for the rest of the week. And so hearing people preaching about sustainability and managing your budgets and staying within your limits, it's like you get it, but also it's like, I'm tired of it. I'm bored of this, Grandad.
This is my 9 to 5 paid job. I don't want to have it
Exactly.
in my football team as well.
This is where I come to dream. This is where I come to be irresponsible. This
Yes.
is where I come to not worry about the consequences so much. And so there is always a balancing act about kind of not making it, as Bob Mills used to say, nobody came here for a lecture on communism, and we have to make sure that doesn't be what this club or any fan-owned club is like. It is actually supposed to be fun.
The concept of fan ownership, I think, is incredibly important to certainly the supporters who were around 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think one of the good things is it seems to still be very important, as you've been saying, to a lot of the people that have come along subsequently. And I'd be devastated if we, as a group, lost that ethos, because to me it's the most important thing about AFC Wimbledon. And I'd love it to be able to apply to other clubs, but circumstances are different in every club. The more it can be done, I think, again, Dave's right, if the inflationary pressures can be taken out of clubs and this desire to spend more, and particularly to spend money you haven't got, could be taken out of it. And if fans can't actually own a club, at least they can have a really concrete say in what those clubs are about.
Certainly. I think we'll cut it there. I think we've got more than enough.
More than enough.
Thanks very much, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Where's our fee being paid?